Part 4. Restructuring and the Invention of Brand Licensing, 1990 to 2003. Chapter 31. The Corporate Crises. The fax machine in the Trump Organization's offices on the 26th floor of Trump Tower had been running since before dawn. It was the autumn of 1990, and the documents emerging from it, term sheets, covenant summaries, collateral assessments, the dense procedural language of institutional finance engaged in the work of protecting itself, accumulated on the receiving tray with the indifferent regularity of a tide coming in. A secretary gathered them in batches and placed them in folders that were then carried to the conference table, where Trump's legal and financial team had established what amounted to a permanent war room. The table's surface invisible beneath the organized disorder of a crisis being managed in real time. Trump came through the door at the hour he always arrived, not early, not late, but precisely when his presence would register most completely, and stood for a moment at the threshold of the room, surveying the papers, the lawyers, the yellow legal pads covered in the handwriting of people who had been there for hours already. His face, in that moment before he fully entered the room, carried an expression that those who knew him well had learned to read with some precision. It was not fear. It was not the bright, performative confidence that he deployed in public settings. It was something more compressed, a calculation happening behind the eyes, a man taking the measure of a situation and deciding, in the span of a breath, how to be inside it. Then he sat down, reached for the nearest folder, and began to read. The autumn of 1990 found the American economy in a recession that had been officially underway since July, its arrival announced not by a single dramatic event, but by the accumulation of indicators that recessions always produce. Rising unemployment, tightening credit, the particular anxiety that moves through commercial real estate markets when the phones stop ringing and the vacancy rates begin their slow, demoralizing climb. The savings and loan crisis had by this point consumed more than 1,000 institutions and was well on its way to costing the federal government, which is to say the taxpayers, somewhere in the range of $130 billion in bailout costs. Drexel Burnham Lambert was gone. Michael Milken had pleaded guilty in April to 6 counts of securities violations and would be sentenced in November to 10 years in prison, later reduced on appeal. The junk bond market that had financed the decade's leveraged excess was not merely deflated, but discredited, its instruments trading at fractions of their face value, their holders calculating losses with the grim arithmetic of people who had made a bet they now understood they had never fully comprehended. For Trump, the recession was not background context. It was the specific environment in which every one of his obligations was now being evaluated, and the evaluation was not going well. The personal debt load that his advisors had been managing since the summer's bank negotiations had not diminished through the autumn. It had, if anything, become more precisely quantified, which is a different thing from diminished, but feels, in the lived experience of the person at the center of it, considerably worse. Precision, in a debt crisis, is the enemy of hope. As long as the numbers remain approximate, they can be argued with. When the bank's workout officers produce their final assessments, and the collateral is valued at current market rather than aspirational projection, the gap between what is owed and what the assets will bring becomes a fixed and unforgiving quantity. The gap in Trump's case was enormous. The precise figure has been reported variously across the years, but the most credible reconstructions of his position in late 1990 place his total personal liability, the debt for which he was personally guarantor, as distinct from the corporate obligations secured only against the properties themselves, in the range of $900 million. This was not a figure that could be managed through operational improvement or marketing investment, or the careful cultivation of the perception of strength. It required, in the language of the restructuring professionals, who were now central to his life in a way that no professional had ever been before, a fundamental reorganization of the relationship between Trump's assets and his obligations. The corporate crises were, in the technical sense, multiple and distinct. The Trump Taj Mahal had already undergone its initial debt restructuring, with bondholders accepting reduced interest rates in exchange for equity. The Trump Castle Associates, the corporate entity that operated a second Atlantic City casino, filed for bankruptcy protection in March 1992. Trump Plaza Hotel, the Manhattan property, not the Atlantic City casino of the same name, was headed toward a restructuring that would ultimately transfer a 49% equity interest to Citibank and 5 other lenders. The Trump Shuttle's debt had been surrendered to its lenders the previous year. Each of these proceedings was legally distinct, procedurally separate, managed by different sets of lawyers and financial advisors operating under different jurisdictional frameworks. And yet they were experienced by the man at the center of them as a single, continuous, suffocating pressure, a simultaneous calling in of everything he had built, across every front, with no sequencing that allowed him to address one crisis before the next arrived. The core conflict of this period was therefore not any single restructuring negotiation, but the meta-problem that all of them together created, the problem of agency. Trump had spent his entire adult life as the initiating force in every situation he entered. He decided what to build, where to build it, what to call it, what it would look like. He decided when to buy and when to sell, and what price to pay and what price to accept. The exercise of will, the translation of his own judgment into the physical and commercial reality of buildings and casinos and hotels, was not merely his professional method. It was the organizing principle of his identity. The debt crisis of 1990 and 1991 had transferred a significant portion of that agency to other people, to the bank's workout officers, to the restructuring advisors, to the lawyers who drafted the covenants that now governed what he could spend and what he could sell, and what decisions required creditor approval before they could be implemented. He was not, in any formal sense, subject to the authority of a bankruptcy court. The restructurings were conducted outside of Chapter 11, through private negotiation, and this distinction mattered enormously to Trump, mattered in fact more than virtually any other single element of his situation. The word bankruptcy was not merely a legal term to him. It was a verdict, a public assessment of failure that he understood with the instinct of a man who had lived his entire career in the pages of newspapers, would define him in ways that no subsequent recovery could fully undo. He resisted it with a tenacity that his creditors found by turns impressive and infuriating. He was willing to accept almost any other arrangement: reduced ownership stakes, board oversight, spending restrictions, asset sales, in exchange for keeping the restructurings out of court and off the courthouse steps where the wire services posted their reporters. The banks, for reasons that mixed institutional self-interest with genuine assessments of recovery value, were largely willing to accommodate this preference. A private restructuring was faster, cheaper, and more flexible than a bankruptcy proceeding. It avoided the automatic stay provisions that would have complicated the casino's gaming licenses, a consideration of genuine practical importance, since the New Jersey Casino Control Commission had regulatory authority over any ownership changes in licensed properties. And it preserved, at least nominally, the operating continuity that gave the restructured assets their best chance of generating the returns that the new debt arrangements required. The man who became, during this period, the central external figure in Trump's financial survival was Kenneth Moelis, a young banker at Donaldson, Lufkin and Jenrette, who had been brought in to advise on the restructuring negotiations, and who possessed, in addition to genuine technical skill, the particular interpersonal dexterity required to manage a client who was accustomed to being the smartest person in every room, and was now, in the rooms that mattered most, dependent on the expertise of others. Moelis, who would go on to found one of the most successful independent investment banks in the country, navigated the Trump relationship during this period with a patience and a strategic clarity that those who observed it have consistently described as exceptional. He understood, intuitively, that Trump's continued psychological investment in the process was not separate from the commercial outcome, but constitutive of it. A Trump who felt managed, diminished, reduced to the passive recipient of decisions made by others, would be a Trump who became unpredictable, who would say things to reporters that complicated the negotiations, who would make gestures of independence that cost everyone money. A Trump who felt that he was, in some meaningful sense, directing his own rescue, that the restructuring was something he was doing rather than something being done to him, was a Trump who could be kept inside a process that required sustained cooperation over many months. The keyhole moment of this period came during a negotiating session in which the representatives of multiple creditor banks were pressing for the sale of a specific Trump asset, one of the Manhattan real estate properties that Trump considered not merely commercially valuable, but personally significant, a building whose address carried associations with his early career and his sense of his own history in the city. The banks had identified it as the clearest path to a material reduction in the personal guarantee exposure, and their argument was financially sound. The property would sell, in the then current market, at a price that would retire a specific tranche of debt and simplify the overall restructuring in ways that the advisors on both sides agreed were meaningful. Trump refused. Not conditionally, not subject to negotiation about price or timing or the application of proceeds. He refused with the flat, unqualified directness of a man who has decided that this particular thing is not for sale and that the decision is his to make, regardless of what the arithmetic recommends. He offered, instead, a counterproposal that involved a different asset, one of lesser strategic importance to him, of roughly comparable but slightly lower market value, and absorbed the financial disadvantage of the substitution without apparent distress, because the disadvantage was financial, and the thing he was protecting was not. The banks accepted the substitution after several weeks of additional negotiation. The property he had refused to sell remained in his portfolio. Whether this constituted stubbornness or strategic clarity or simply the operation of an attachment that he recognized in himself and chose not to override is a question that the record does not resolve. What it demonstrates, with the precision of a keyhole, is that even in the moment of maximum financial vulnerability, Trump retained the capacity to make decisions based on criteria that were not fully legible to the people across the table, to operate according to a set of values that existed alongside and sometimes in tension with the purely financial calculus that the situation seemed to demand. He was not simply a man trying to minimize his losses. He was a man trying to remain, in some specific and personally defined sense, himself. The restructurings were substantially complete by 1992, though their consequences would extend through the decade. The Atlantic City casinos had been reorganized into new corporate structures with altered ownership arrangements. The personal guarantee exposure had been reduced, through asset sales and debt forgiveness, to a level that was still large by any ordinary standard, but was no longer existentially threatening in the immediate term. Trump had surrendered equity, surrendered cash, surrendered the Trump shuttle, and significant portions of his real estate portfolio. He had not surrendered his name, and he had not surrendered his public presence, and these, as he had argued to the banks and as the subsequent years would prove, were not trivial assets. He emerged from the crisis a diminished figure in the accounting sense and an undimmed one in the media sense, which was a combination that struck most observers as anomalous, and that Trump appeared to regard as entirely logical. The empire was smaller. The brand was intact. The name still appeared on buildings that people walked past every day in the city where everything important happened, and the man who bore it still appeared on page 6 and in the business columns, and on the television programs where people who had done interesting things were invited to explain themselves. What neither Trump nor his creditors nor his advisors could yet see in the early 1990s was that the crisis had done something to his understanding of capital that would reshape the next decade of his career in ways none of them anticipated. That the experience of nearly losing everything had not made him more cautious, as such experiences make most people, but had instead clarified for him, with the cold precision of hard-won knowledge, exactly which part of his enterprise was irreducible, which element could survive the loss of everything else, and how, if the conditions were right and the opportunity presented itself, that element might be made to generate its own entirely new form of return without requiring him to build another building, borrow another dollar, or give any bank in America a single additional claim on his future. Chapter 32. Restructuring Liabilities. The fax machine in the corner of the 14th floor conference room had been running for 3 hours straight. It was February of 1990, and the paper curling onto the floor of Trump Tower represented, in aggregate, the slow-motion collapse of everything Donald Trump had spent the previous decade assembling. Bankers from Citibank, from Chase, from manufacturers Hanover, institutions whose names alone conjured the granite weight of American finance, were transmitting their position papers, their covenant notices, their polite but clinical declarations that the loans were due, the terms had been breached, and the patience of creditors had reached its constitutional limit. Trump sat at the head of the table in a charcoal suit, his tie loosened by perhaps a quarter inch, which for him constituted visible distress. He did not read the faxes as they arrived. He let the assistants handle that. What he did, instead, was talk, to no one in particular, to the room, to the idea of the room, about how the press was going to get this wrong, how they always got it wrong, how the story of what was happening here was not the story anyone outside these walls would ever bother to tell. The America that surrounded that conference room in early 1990 was itself in the process of recalibration. The Reagan decade had ended not with a flourish but with a hangover, the savings and loan crisis metastasizing through the financial system, commercial real estate markets contracting sharply in New York and Atlantic City alike, and a new president in George H.W. Bush who embodied a kind of patrician sobriety that seemed almost to rebuke the leveraged excess of the years just prior. The junk bond market, which had underwritten so much of the 1980s expansion, including, in indirect but meaningful ways, Trump's own acquisition spree, had imploded with the arrest of Michael Milken in 1989 and the collapse of Drexel Burnham Lambert. The cultural machinery that had celebrated the dealmaker as American archetype was grinding to a halt. Fortune magazine, which had placed Trump on its cover and treated his instincts as a species of genius, was now preparing the kind of accounting that follows every boom. The forensic reconstruction of what had actually been purchased, at what price, and with whose money. The answer, in Trump's case, was approximately $3.4 billion in debt, a number so large it paradoxically became a kind of armor. The core conflict of this period was not, as his critics preferred to frame it, one of simple overreach. It was something more structurally interesting. A man who had built his identity entirely around the performance of invincibility was now required, by the laws of corporate finance and the demands of secured creditors, to sit in rooms and negotiate from weakness. This was new territory. Trump had always understood leverage as a tool he wielded against others. Now leverage was the instrument being pressed against him, and the question was whether the same instincts that had served him in ascent could be redeployed in a posture of managed retreat. 6 times over the course of the following decade, through the bankruptcies of the Trump Taj Mahal in 1991, the Trump Plaza Hotel and Casino in 1992, the Plaza Hotel in 1992, Trump Hotels and Casino Resorts in 2004, Trump Entertainment Resorts in 2009, and the earlier, less publicized restructuring of Trump's castle, he would answer that question in the affirmative. Not by winning in any conventional sense, but by making the alternative to his continued involvement look worse than the restructuring itself. The Taj Mahal filing in Atlantic City, in November of 1991, was the first formal declaration, and it arrived under the weight of its own mythology. Trump had opened the casino in April of 1990 with characteristic amplitude, calling it the eighth wonder of the world, staging a press spectacle that overwhelmed the building's actual financial architecture. The Taj had been financed with $675 million in high-yield junk bonds, carrying an interest rate of 14%, a debt service obligation that required the casino to generate approximately $1.3 million per day just to cover interest payments before a single dollar of principal was retired. Atlantic City's gaming revenues were growing, but not at that rate, not in that market, and not against the competition that had simultaneously expanded along the boardwalk. By the time the Chapter 11 petition was filed, the Taj had missed 2 interest payments, and the bondholders, a dispersed and fractious group of institutional investors, were weighing their options. What they discovered, as negotiations proceeded, was that Trump understood their incentives better than they understood his. Liquidation of a casino property in a distressed Atlantic City market would yield pennies. A restructured entity with Trump's name still attached, still marketing, still drawing bus tours from Philadelphia and New York, was worth considerably more. He reduced the interest rate on the bonds, surrendered 50% of his equity stake, and walked away from the table, having retained operational control of an asset he no longer technically owned in full. He spoke of it afterward as a negotiation he had won. The bondholders, calculating their alternatives, did not strongly disagree. The anecdote that illuminates the period most precisely does not come from any courtroom or restructuring conference. It comes from a lunch recounted by Alan Pomerantz, one of the lead attorneys coordinating the negotiations with Trump's 90 creditor banks in the spring of 1990. The banks had dispatched their representatives for what was expected to be a formal preliminary session, an orientation meeting, essentially, in which the scope of the workout would be defined and the ground rules established. Trump arrived, as was his custom, slightly late. He sat down, poured water, and proceeded to describe to the assembled bankers, men whose institutions held paper on his properties, whose careers were now entangled with the fate of his portfolio, a new project he was considering. A development on the west side of Manhattan. A golf course, perhaps in Florida. He spoke for 20 minutes about expansion, before the first creditor representative managed to redirect the conversation toward the restructuring terms. Pomerantz later observed that Trump seemed to understand, at an almost cellular level, that the moment you accept the other side's framing of a negotiation, their terminology, their urgency, their definition of the problem, you have already conceded something essential. By opening with vision rather than distress, Trump was not being delusional. He was being strategic. He was reminding the creditors, before the hard conversation began, that they needed him to believe in what came next, because without his belief there was no next. The relationship that most defined this restructuring period was the one Trump developed with his primary banker at Citibank, a vice president named John Morrissey, and more broadly with the shifting ensemble of workout specialists the major banks assigned to manage the Trump portfolio. These were not adversarial relationships in the traditional sense. Workout banking in this era operated on a set of incentives that aligned, at least partially, with the borrower's recovery. The banks did not want Trump to fail catastrophically. They wanted him to fail just enough to accept terms, then stabilize. What they found, through repeated engagement across multiple restructurings, was that Trump was simultaneously easier and harder to deal with than they had anticipated. Easier because he was decisive. He did not require weeks to process options or consult boards. He processed in the room and gave answers. Harder because he was constitutionally incapable of accepting language that implied failure. Consent decrees, restructuring agreements, revised covenant packages, all of them had to be drafted in ways that allowed Trump to emerge from the signing table and describe the outcome as a deal he had engineered. The bankers learned to accommodate this. They adjusted the terminology, softened the characterizations, and in several instances allowed Trump to hold press conferences at which he characterized the restructuring terms as victories of his own design. The bankers attended some of these press conferences. They did not correct the record. Their interests were served by his continued engagement, his continued salesmanship, his continued ability to fill casino floors and hotel lobbies with people who believed they were experiencing something called Trump. What emerged from the wreckage, slowly and then with increasing clarity, was a model that had not existed in American business in quite this form before. Trump began to separate the concept of his name from the underlying assets his name had once been attached to. If the casino could be restructured out from under him, the equity diluted, the debt renegotiated, the ownership redistributed among creditors, what remained inalienable was the trademark, the brand, the cultural signal that the word Trump had come to transmit. He did not own the Taj Mahal in the same way he once had. But the Taj Mahal could not market itself without him. It needed his face on the advertising, his name in the press releases, his willingness to appear at openings and anniversaries and championship boxing matches held in the arena he had built. He understood that this dependency was itself an asset, one that could be licensed, structured, and eventually transferred onto properties he did not need to capitalize or build himself. The failures of the early 1990s, in other words, were not merely survived. They were, in a manner Trump would spend the next decade systematizing, converted. By the mid-1990s, he was moving away from the model of debt-financed acquisition entirely and towards something more elegant from a capital efficiency standpoint. He would license his name to developers who would finance, build, and absorb the risk of actual construction, while Trump received fees, retained approval rights over design and marketing, and kept the brand association without the balance sheet exposure. Trump International Hotel and Tower in New York, completed in 1997, was an early iteration, a property at Columbus Circle that bore his name without requiring him to carry the weight of full ownership. The model would eventually extend to golf courses, residential towers, and properties in markets as distant as Istanbul and Bali. He was not yet calling it a licensing empire. But the architecture was already in place, built quietly on the foundation of what his creditors had forced him to learn, that the name was worth more than the building, and the building was worth more with the name. The 6 bankruptcies, reviewed in their totality, form a pattern that resists the simple narrative of recklessness and rescue that his critics preferred. What they reveal instead is a man navigating a system, the Chapter 11 mechanism, the workout banking apparatus, the creditor negotiation process, with a sophistication that was partly intuitive and partly acquired under pressure. He did not emerge from each restructuring as a diminished figure. He emerged in each case as the indispensable party, the one around whom the reorganized entity would have to be constructed, because the alternative was a value destruction that served no one's interest. The lesson the financial system taught him, without intending to, was that personal branding at sufficient scale could function as a kind of structural protection, that if enough capital was tied to your continued involvement and your continued belief, the institutions that had lent that capital would protect you too. His father Fred, who had built his own empire through careful conservative accumulation, who had made his fortune by avoiding exactly the kind of exposure that Donald had embraced, watched these years with a mixture of anguish and bewilderment. Fred Trump had always kept his books conservative, his leverage modest, his ambitions calibrated to what the numbers could support. He had tried, in the late 1980s, to extend capital to Donald in ways that would later become legally complicated. Purchases of casino chips at the Taj that were investigated by New Jersey gaming regulators as a possible undisclosed loan. By 1990, Fred was in his early 80s, and his cognition was beginning to show the early signs of decline. The son who had outgrown his father's model, who had attempted to scale the Queen's playbook into a Manhattan legend, was now navigating consequences his father had never risked incurring. The distance between them, generational, temperamental, philosophical, had never been more legible than in those years when Donald sat in restructuring sessions and Fred sat in the house in Jamaica Estates, surrounded by the evidence of a more careful life. What Trump could not yet see, in those conference rooms stacked with creditor paper, was that the brand he was learning to treat as his most durable asset would eventually require a stage larger than Atlantic City, larger than Fifth Avenue, larger than any casino floor or hotel lobby could provide, and that the machinery for reaching that stage was already being assembled quietly in a medium he had not yet fully understood. Chapter 33. The Marla Maples Era. The cameras found him before he could find his footing. It was January 1990, and Donald Trump stood at the arrivals terminal at Aspen's Sardifield Airport, tanned, coiffed, visibly coiled, while somewhere outside the sliding glass doors, two women who had both believed themselves to be the center of his life were about to occupy the same mountain air. Ivana Trump had arrived first, as she almost always did, organized and exact, a woman who ran their household with the same cold efficiency that she had brought to the Plaza Hotel's renovation. Marla Maples, 26 years old, a Georgia-born actress who had been installed quietly in Trump's orbit for the better part of 2 years, was already on the slopes. What happened next, the confrontation, the tears, the shouted accusations on the mountain, would become one of those tabloid ruptures so complete, so loud, that it detonated not merely a marriage but an entire mythology. The mythology of Donald Trump as the untouchable man, the man whose private life moved with the same frictionless momentum as his deals, was over. Everything that followed would have to be rebuilt from its wreckage. To understand why the collapse mattered as much as it did, why it registered as something beyond ordinary scandal, one has to feel the particular texture of American celebrity culture at the turn of that decade. The 1980s had produced a specific species of hero, the leveraged, the bold, the conspicuously wealthy. Tom Wolfe had named the type in fiction, and Trump had embodied it in fact, a man who seemed to have grasped something essential about the era's appetite for spectacle, and fed it without apology. His 1987 memoir, The Art of the Deal, had sold more than 1 million copies and installed him in the cultural imagination, not merely as a developer but as a philosopher of winning, a shaman of the deal. But 1990 was a different country. The decade's opening months brought cascading anxiety. The savings and loan crisis was consuming billions in public money. The junk bond market that had underwritten so much of the Reagan-era expansion was in ruins. And Michael Milken, the era's financial demigod, had just pleaded guilty to securities fraud. America was settling its accounts. The reckless men of the 80s were being called to answer for what they had built and what they had borrowed to build it. Trump, buried beneath nearly $900 million in personal debt and close to $3 billion in corporate obligations, was chief among them. And now, the personal theater of his unraveling was playing simultaneously on the front pages of every tabloid in the country. The core conflict of this period in Trump's life was not, as it might have appeared from the outside, simply a matter of romantic disorder. The marriage's collapse and the financial reckoning arrived together, and together they forced upon him a question he had never seriously been asked to answer: who was Donald Trump when the empire was not expanding? His identity had been constructed entirely on the premise of momentum, of perpetual acquisition, of the deal not yet done. Bankruptcy, even the managed, negotiated, technical variety he was now navigating with teams of bankers and lawyers, was a category of experience his psyche had no architecture to contain. And into that void, Marla Maples arrived, with the particular force of someone who wanted something entirely different from him than anyone had wanted before. She did not want a building, or a casino license, or a line of credit. She wanted, or seemed to want, something recognizable as a normal life, a public acknowledgement, a name, a future. The tension between what she required and what he was constituted to give would define the next 4 years more completely than any restructuring agreement. He chose to make the affair public in the manner that a man like Trump always chose such things, not through confession or remorse, but through escalation. In February 1990, barely a month after the Aspen confrontation, the New York Post ran a front page that would achieve a kind of permanent residence in the American tabloid canon. "Best sex I've ever had." The quote was attributed to Marla Maples, the subject of her praise unmistakable. Years later, there would be competing accounts of how that headline had come to exist, who had whispered it to which reporter, whether the tip had arrived organically or been placed with surgical precision. But the question of its origin mattered less in the end than Trump's response to it. He did not deny it. He did not retreat. He gave interviews in which he permitted himself a small, satisfied pause before discussing it. The pause of a man who understood that even the most damaging publicity could be absorbed and redirected if you were willing to stand inside it without flinching. A different man in that position, a man of more conventional political caution or personal embarrassment, might have retreated into silence. Trump turned the headline into a kind of advertisement. The tabloids had always been his natural medium, and he understood their grammar intuitively. Denial killed a story slowly and unsatisfyingly, while engagement fed it and gave it shape and eventually let it pass. What this revealed, the keyhole through which the larger character becomes visible, was not simply a talent for media manipulation, though that talent was genuine and formidable. It was something more structural, more revelatory, about how Trump processed reality and consequence. He did not experience shame in the register that most public figures understood it. He experienced setback as a temporary condition, a problem of optics rather than morality, a situation to be managed rather than atoned for. His first wife, Ivana, would describe in her own memoir the particular coldness of the marriage's final years, the way his attention had drifted long before it found a specific destination. But what struck observers who watched him during those months of tabloid exposure was not guilt. There was no visible guilt, but rather a kind of entrepreneurial alertness to the possibilities within the chaos. While his lawyers negotiated debt restructuring with Citibank and a consortium of other lenders, while Ivana's attorneys extracted from him a settlement that would be revised and contested for years, Trump was already calculating how to reassemble himself. The disaster was, in his accounting, material to work with. Marla Maples herself is essential to understanding this period not merely as a romantic figure, but as a mirror, or perhaps more accurately as a counterforce, against which Trump's essential nature pressed and revealed itself. She had come to New York from Cohutta, Georgia, a small place that had prepared her for neither the city's scale nor the particular ecosystem she was entering. She was, by most accounts of people who knew her then, genuinely warm, spiritually oriented in a way that Trump found alternately amusing and incomprehensible, and possessed of a hopefulness about the relationship that those around her found both touching and eventually heartbreaking. She gave interviews in which she spoke about their connection in terms of destiny and love, language that Trump himself almost never used without irony or quotation marks. She believed, or chose to believe, that the chaos of how they had come together would resolve into something stable and real. Trump, for his part, was genuinely fond of her, in the way that he was capable of being genuinely fond of anyone, attentive when present, distracted when not, loyal in the particular sense that he did not wish her ill, only that he wished himself always first. Their relationship, tested immediately by his financial collapse and the grinding spectacle of the divorce proceedings, entered a strange suspended state through the early 1990s. They were photographed together, separated, reconciled, and separated again with a regularity that kept them on the tabloid front pages even as the financial story gradually resolved. The debt was restructured. The Taj Mahal, the Plaza, the airline, assets were surrendered, agreements signed, the empire reduced from its peak excess to something merely very large rather than cosmically leveraged. And through all of it, the drama with Marla continued, a personal soap opera running in parallel to the financial one, feeding each other's oxygen and keeping his name alive in the public conversation during years when the business news about him was almost uniformly grim. They married in December 1993 at the Plaza Hotel, the same Plaza Hotel he had recently lost controlling interest in, a detail either poignant or absurd depending on one's disposition, in a ceremony that was enormous and glittering and covered by every outlet that covered such things. Their daughter Tiffany had been born 2 months earlier, and the wedding had the air of an obligation fulfilled, a gesture toward the conventional that both participants seemed to understand was also, in some ways, a performance. The guest list ran to 1,000 names. The dress was a Norman Hartnell design, white silk, with a train that required attendance. O.J. Simpson attended. Howard Stern attended. The room had the quality of a production rather than a sacrament, and several guests would later recall the specific feeling of watching two people stand at an altar in front of cameras and wondering what precisely was being solemnized. What was being solemnized, one suspects in retrospect, was less the marriage than the comeback. By late 1993, Trump had begun to stabilize. The debt restructurings had held. He had retained Mar-a-Lago and had already begun converting it from a private residence into a private club, a transformation that would prove to be one of his most durable financial insights. The discovery that his name, properly leveraged, could generate income from assets he no longer fully owned by selling access to the idea of Donald Trump rather than the substance of his balance sheet. The wedding at the Plaza was an announcement. The spectacle was back, the cameras were welcome. The man in the tuxedo at the head of the room intended to be watched. Marla Maples was not incidental to this announcement. She was beautiful and blonde and telegenic, and she seemed, at least in photographs, to represent a life that had been chosen rather than merely survived. The image served his purposes. The marriage itself did not survive the decade. By 1997, they had separated, and the divorce was finalized in June of that year. The settlement was reported variously. The prenuptial agreement, contested at points, ultimately shaped its contours. Marla retained custody of Tiffany and moved eventually away from New York, away from the apparatus of his life. She gave interviews over the years that were notable for their restraint, for what they declined to say as much as what they said. She was not, finally, a figure of bitterness, or at least she did not present as one. She seemed to have concluded, with whatever private struggle that conclusion required, that she had passed through something larger than herself and emerged with her name intact. Trump, for his part, rarely spoke of her with specific warmth or specific regret. She had been a chapter, and the chapter had closed, and there were other chapters. What she left behind, her contribution, if that is the right word, to his biography, was a demonstration of what the bankruptcy years had actually produced. He had gone into the early 1990s as a man who built things, towers, casinos, hotels, rinks. He emerged from them as something new and, in some respects, more powerful, a man who sold himself. The licensing model that would eventually put his name on buildings he did not own, on products he did not manufacture, on a television program that made him the most recognized businessman in America, had its origins in this period of radical reduction. When you stripped away the assets, and the bankers had stripped away most of them, what remained was the name. The name was not in default. The name could not be repossessed. And the name, it turned out, was what he had always been selling, the buildings merely its most expensive advertisement. The divorce from Marla was quiet compared to the one before it, almost anticlimactic against the tabloid violence of its predecessor. By 1997, he was already moving in different circles, attending different parties, and somewhere in those circles, at a party in New York that he would later recall with the precision of a man who understood that certain meetings are destiny dressed as coincidence, he had begun to pay attention to a young Slovenian model named Melania Knaus, and the version of Donald Trump that the new century would carry forward, reshaped by bankruptcy and reinvention and the long education of having been publicly humiliated and survived it, was already beginning to compose the face he would present to the world that was coming. Chapter 34. Repositioning, Lower Manhattan. He stood on the sidewalk at the corner of Wall Street and Nassau and looked up. It was the spring of 1995, and the building above him, 71 stories of neo-Gothic limestone, its crown a series of tiered setbacks that tapered toward a copper-clad peak, was in a condition that its architecture did not advertise. From the street, 40 Wall Street still commanded the eye the way it had when it briefly held the title of the world's tallest building in 1930, for the 26 days before the Chrysler Building's spire was raised into the Manhattan sky and rendered the claim obsolete. The setback was decorative now, a historical footnote, but the building itself remained one of the great vertical statements of the pre-war city, a mass of dressed stone and ambition that the decades had not diminished so much as obscured. Trump studied it for a long moment, the way a man studies a problem he is already certain he can solve. The scaffolding on the upper floors, the grime on the lower windows, the vacancy signs that no serious broker was bothering to fill, none of this registered as obstacle. It registered as opportunity at a discount, which in Trump's taxonomy was the closest thing to perfection the real world reliably produced. The mid-1990s, in Lower Manhattan, constituted one of the stranger dissonances in the city's modern history. The financial district, the dense canyon-walled precinct south of Fulton Street, where American capitalism had conducted its most consequential transactions for 2 centuries, was quietly hemorrhaging the very industry whose name it bore. The deregulation of financial markets and the maturation of electronic trading had begun to dissolve the geographic logic that had once made it essential for banks and brokerages to cluster within walking distance of the exchanges. Firms were evaluating Midtown. Firms were evaluating New Jersey. The World Trade Center, which had itself been a disruptive development when it opened in the early 1970s, absorbing tenants and oxygen from the surrounding blocks, now sat at the western edge of the district like a monument to a theory of urban concentration that the market was in the process of quietly revising. Office vacancy rates in Lower Manhattan had climbed above 30% in some corridors. Buildings that had been fully tenanted a decade earlier were running on skeleton occupancy, their landlords negotiating from weakness, their lenders watching the loan-to-value ratios with the quiet dread of men who understood what the numbers implied but were not yet prepared to act on them. It was into this environment that 40 Wall Street arrived in Trump's orbit, not through his own prospecting, as he would later imply, but through a convergence of distressed ownership, a motivated intermediary, and the particular kind of deal structure that the real estate collapse of the early 1990s had made newly possible. The building had a complicated recent past. The Kinson Company, a Hong Kong-based real estate group, had acquired it in the late 1980s with ambitions that the subsequent market collapse had made untenable. The building's ground lease, a structure in which a tenant controls a building while a separate party owns the underlying land, was held by the Hindenburg family, a German banking dynasty whose connection to the property stretched back decades, and whose patience with the current ownership arrangement was, by the mid-1990s, approaching exhaustion. The land lease created a structural complexity that had deterred most potential acquirers. The ground rent obligations, the relationship with the Hindenburgs, the vacancy problem, the capital requirement for renovation. Any one of these would have given a conventional developer pause. In combination, they had effectively placed the building outside the range of institutional interest, which meant that whoever did step in would be stepping in alone, on terms that reflected the market's reluctance, into a building that the city's real estate establishment had collectively decided was too complicated to be worth the trouble. The core conflict Trump faced at 40 Wall Street was not the vacancy rate or the ground lease complexity, though both were genuine obstacles requiring genuine resolution. It was a conflict of credibility, specifically his own. By 1995, Trump's public image had been substantially refracted through the lens of the bankruptcy proceedings of the early part of the decade. The press coverage had been extensive, and from his perspective, tendentiously framed. The overextended developer, the casino impresario brought low by his own appetites, the man whose name on a building had come to signify, for a certain constituency of sophisticated New York real estate players, something closer to risk than reassurance. The institutional brokers who filled Midtown office towers were not rushing to take meetings about a Trump-branded property in a distressed submarket. The corporate tenants, whose long-term leases would be required to justify the capital investment in renovation, were being courted by landlords with cleaner balance sheets and less complicated public profiles. Trump needed 40 Wall Street to work not merely as a financial transaction, but as a narrative transaction, a visible, inarguable demonstration that the restructuring years had been a chapter rather than a conclusion, and that the brand still functioned as an attractor in the market rather than a deterrent. He acquired control of the building's master lease in 1995 for a price that various accounts have placed between $1 and $10 million, a range so wide as to suggest that the transaction structure was as opaque to outside observers as it was advantageous to the party who understood it most clearly. What Trump had effectively purchased was not the building and not the land, but the right to operate the building, and to capture the spread between what he could generate in rental income and what he owed in ground rent to the Hinbergs. The renovation he then undertook, ultimately costing in the range of $35 million, financed through a combination of his own resources and Deutsche Bank lending, was the largest rehabilitation project in Lower Manhattan during that period, a physical commitment to a submarket that the rest of the industry was treating as a controlled retreat. He restored the lobby to something approximating its 1930 grandeur: marble floors, bronze fixtures, the vertical sweep of the interior arcade that the building's architect, H. Craig Severance, had designed to announce arrival rather than merely facilitate it. He renamed it the Trump Building. He put his name on the facade, in letters large enough to be read from the water. The anecdote that opens the door onto Trump's essential character during this period involves not a negotiation or a design decision, but a phone call, or rather a series of phone calls, that he made to real estate journalists and financial columnists in New York during the renovation. Several reporters who covered commercial real estate during the mid-1990s have described receiving unsolicited calls from Trump in which he would, with a specificity that required preparation, recite the building's leasing statistics. Not approximate figures. Specific ones: the square footage under negotiation, the names of prospective tenants he was in conversations with, the rental rate per square foot he expected to achieve relative to the market, the timeline for completion of the lobby restoration. He was not returning their calls. He was initiating contact with people who had not asked to hear from him, to deliver information that was, in most cases, accurate, verifiable, and strategically chosen to displace the narrative of distress with a narrative of momentum. One reporter, recounting the experience years later, noted that Trump seemed to understand something about the economics of media coverage that most subjects did not, that a story requires a protagonist with agency, and that a protagonist who calls you with data is providing the structural element, forward motion, that makes a story publishable. He was not merely managing his press. He was constructing the conditions under which favorable press became the logical journalistic outcome. The relationship that defined the 40 Wall Street period, and that illuminates something essential about how Trump's operational model functioned in practice, was his engagement with his property management team, and more specifically with the German landlord family, whose cooperation was not optional. The Hinbergs were not publicity-oriented people. They were European banking aristocracy of the old variety: private, formal, transactional in the specific sense of preferring that transactions conclude efficiently and without drama. Trump's instinct in most relationships was to dominate the narrative, to make himself the central figure in any room or any deal. With the Hindenburgs, he modulated this instinct, not entirely but sufficiently. He understood that the ground lease relationship required a counterparty who was satisfied rather than managed, who received their rent on schedule and did not find themselves quoted in American newspapers in connection with anything irregular. He kept the relationship functional and quiet, which for Trump represented a genuine discipline. The renovation proceeded. The leasing activity began to generate press. And the Hindenburgs, receiving their ground rent payments on time from a tenant who was demonstrably improving the value of the land beneath their building, had no occasion for complaint. By the late 1990s, the building was approaching respectable occupancy. The tenant roster included financial services firms, law offices, and the kind of mid-sized professional organizations that formed the backbone of Lower Manhattan's remaining commercial ecosystem. The renovation of the lobby had become a reference point in conversations about the district's rehabilitation, cited by city officials and real estate brokers as evidence that private investment in the area was viable, that the post-war exodus of major financial institutions had not rendered the neighborhood permanently inhospitable to ambition. Trump, characteristically, accepted this characterization and amplified it, positioning himself in press interviews as the visionary who had believed in Lower Manhattan when no one else did, who had committed capital and credibility to a block that the market had abandoned, and whose instincts had been vindicated by the subsequent uptick in district-wide leasing activity. The version of events was not inaccurate. It was, however, edited, compressed in ways that removed the structural advantages of the distressed acquisition price, the ground lease complexity that had depressed competition, and the Deutsche Bank financing that had provided the renovation capital. What remained was the story of the lone contrarian, and the story was not without merit. He had, in fact, bet on a building the market had dismissed, and the building had, in fact, recovered. The surrounding context in Trump's telling was simply not the point. What 40 Wall Street accomplished for Trump extended well beyond its financial returns, which were real but not transformative at the scale of his overall portfolio. What it accomplished was the reconstruction of a specific kind of legitimacy, the legitimacy of the operating developer, the man who could point to a building in a major American city and say, "I saw what this could be, I put my name on it, and here it stands." During the bankruptcy years, the buildings he was associated with had become associated, by extension, with crisis. 40 Wall Street reversed the directional flow of that association. The building, restored and active, began to do what good real estate does for a capable brand. It provided visible, durable evidence of the claim. Every limousine that passed the corner of Wall and Nassau, every tourist photograph taken of the skyline from the Staten Island ferry, every mention in a guidebook or a travel piece about Lower Manhattan's historic architecture, all of it carried the name Trump, now affixed not to a cautionary tale, but to a 71-story monument that had been declining when he arrived and was not declining anymore. The timing of the recovery also placed Trump in an interesting relationship to the larger arc of the city's fortunes. New York, in the second half of the 1990s, was undergoing a civic renaissance that few had predicted and almost no one had planned for. The crime rate was falling, dramatically and then astonishingly, under a policing strategy whose causes would be argued over for decades. Tourism was recovering. The city's cultural machinery, the restaurants, the galleries, the theater season, the general metabolism of public life, was running at a pitch that recalled the post-war decades of genuine urban vitality. Giuliani was in City Hall, prosecutorial in his approach to disorder, evangelical in his belief that the city's physical environment could be managed into respectability. The mood in New York was one of rediscovery, of the city as a place that worked, that delivered on its promises, that rewarded investment and punished timidity. Trump read this mood with the accuracy of a man whose entire professional life had been spent treating cultural atmosphere as a market signal, and he leaned into it. The Trump building at 40 Wall Street became, in his telling, and to some degree in reality, an emblem of that rediscovery, a building that had declined alongside the city and recovered with it, under stewardship that had recognized the recovery before it arrived. By 2001, the building was a stabilized asset in a stabilizing district, and Trump was in the early stages of turning his attention toward the medium that would ultimately do more for the Trump name than any single building ever had or could. The construction of the brand through real estate, through lobbies and facades and press releases and unsolicited phone calls to reporters, had taken him as far as physical assets could take him. What lay ahead required a different kind of stage, one that reached into living rooms rather than financial districts, one that did not require a viewer to walk past a building in Lower Manhattan to absorb the signal that the name was intended to transmit. And the infrastructure for that stage was already in place, waiting for a format that would make him not merely a name on a building, but a figure in the national imagination in a way that no developer, however skilled at the press conference and however fluent in the language of the deal, had ever quite managed to become. Chapter 35. The West Side Rail Yards. He stood at the western edge of Manhattan and looked at 77 acres of nothing, and he felt for the first time in years like himself again. The wind came off the Hudson hard and cold that morning, carrying with it the particular smell of the river in winter, diesel and distance and something organic underneath, the smell of a city that had been built on water and had never entirely forgotten it. The rail yard stretched before him in both directions, a vast industrial scar running from 59th Street to 72nd Street along the waterfront, cluttered with rusting infrastructure and the ghosts of a freight economy that had long since migrated elsewhere. To anyone else, standing on that frozen ground in the early 1990s, the site would have registered as a problem. An enormous, contaminated, logistically nightmarish problem requiring capital he did not have and political relationships he had spent the better part of a decade abusing. Trump looked at it and saw a city. He had always been a man who saw cities where other people saw problems, and whatever the bankruptcy proceedings had taken from him, the plaza, the airline, the liquid confidence of the leverage years, they had not taken that. The vision was still there, intact and impatient, and the West Side rail yards were going to be its proof. The site had a history as tangled as the rail lines that crossed it. Trump had first acquired the option to develop it in 1974, when he was 27 years old and still operating in his father's considerable shadow, and the acquisition itself had been a piece of early theatrical audacity. He had persuaded the Penn Central Railroad's bankruptcy trustees that he, a young outer borough developer with no Manhattan track record, was the right man to transform their most burdensome asset. The option had lapsed, been renegotiated, litigated, redesigned, and reimagined across nearly 2 decades, surviving multiple zoning battles and a spectacular proposal in the late 1980s for a development called Television City, which would have included the world's tallest building and a massive NBC studio complex, and which the city's planning apparatus had received with something between skepticism and alarm. That proposal had collapsed along with everything else. But Trump had held on to the underlying land position through the wreckage of his finances, partly through luck, and partly through the specific stubbornness that was, depending on one's perspective, either his most valuable character trait or his most dangerous one. He would not let it go. The rail yards had become, in some private accounting, the place where his future lived. The early 1990s were, for New York City, a period of deep and particular anxiety. The crack epidemic had not yet exhausted itself. The murder rate, which had peaked at over 2,000 homicides in 1990, was only beginning its long descent. Times Square remained a theater district in the most ironic sense, a stage for poverty and vice, its famous marquees advertising peep shows rather than Broadway productions. The fiscal crisis of the 1970s had never been fully metabolized. It lived in the city's institutional memory as a permanent warning about the distance between ambition and solvency. And yet, underneath this anxiety, something was shifting. Rudy Giuliani had been elected mayor in 1993 on a platform of order and economic revival. Capital was beginning to re-examine the city's possibilities. The waterfront, long neglected and industrially encumbered, was being looked at with new eyes by developers and planners who understood that a post-industrial Manhattan might transform its edges into something magnificent. The West Side rail yards, in this context, were not merely a development site. They were a thesis about what New York could become, and Trump, for all his financial embarrassment, was still the man who held the thesis. The central obstacle he faced was not, as it had been in the 1980s, a shortage of nerve or vision. It was a shortage of money, and more specifically, a shortage of the credibility with American lenders that might have produced that money. The major banks that had financed his expansion, Citibank, manufacturers Hanover, Chase, had spent the early part of the decade restructuring his debts and extracting concessions, and their appetite for further Trump exposure was, to put it diplomatically, limited. American institutional capital had learned its lesson about leveraged bets on Donald Trump, and the lesson had been expensive enough that the tuition was unlikely to be forgotten quickly. He needed a different source of capital, and the source he found was one that said something important about both his resourcefulness and about the new architecture of global money that was reshaping real estate development in the 1990s. The Hong Kong investors who became his partners in the West Side Rail Yards project arrived through a set of introductions that Trump handled with the same instinctive salesmanship he brought to everything. The group, which coalesced around Henry Cheng Kar Shun and his family's New World Development Company, one of Hong Kong's major property conglomerates, was at that particular moment in history engaged in exactly the kind of capital migration that the political circumstances of Hong Kong demanded. The 1997 handover of Hong Kong to Chinese sovereignty was approaching with the certainty of a calendar event, and the wealthiest families in the territory were, with varying degrees of urgency, diversifying their assets into markets that would not be subject to whatever political weather followed the transition. New York real estate, stable, dollar-denominated, and structurally resistant to the kind of political risk that haunted the Pacific, was precisely the category of investment that made sense. Trump, understanding this perfectly, positioned himself not merely as a developer seeking capital, but as a guide, a New York native who could shepherd sophisticated foreign money through the city's labyrinthine regulatory and political environment. He was selling his expertise and his relationships and his name, in that order, because his balance sheet was in no condition to be the primary selling point. The partnership that emerged, eventually structured under the corporate identity that would produce a development called Trump Place, was a genuine collaboration of unequal but complementary strengths. The Hong Kong partners brought the capital. Trump brought the site, the approvals strategy, the media presence, and the particular form of civic intimidation that he had spent decades cultivating. He knew which community board members needed to be attended to and which could be safely ignored. He knew which city officials responded to flattery and which to implicit threat. He knew the New York press well enough to understand how to use a favorable story at the precise moment when a favorable story could shift a political calculation. These were not skills you could hire. They accumulated over decades of operating in a specific ecosystem, and Trump possessed them in abundance even at his lowest financial ebb. The revealing action came not in a boardroom or a planning session, but in a moment of naked territorial instinct that several people who witnessed it would later describe with a mixture of admiration and discomfort. During one of the community review processes that the development required, a contentious public hearing in which neighborhood groups and preservation advocates and elected officials cycled through the microphone with their objections. A rival developer, emboldened by Trump's diminished financial stature, had begun circulating quietly among the relevant city officials with an alternative proposal for the site. The rival's approach was more modest, more architecturally deferential to the surrounding neighborhood, and, crucially, came with fewer regulatory complications because it promised fewer units and less density. It was, by the standards of urban planning bureaucracy, a more manageable proposal. Word reached Trump through one of the informal channels he had always maintained more carefully than his formal ones. A call from someone who worked in a city office, a conversation at a dinner, the invisible telegraph of a city that, for all its millions of inhabitants, conducted its real business in rooms small enough that everyone of consequence eventually knew what everyone else was doing. Trump's response was not to engage with the rival's proposal on its merits. It was to make the rival's continued participation in the conversation more trouble than it was worth. He called people. He suggested, in the careful language of a man who understood exactly where the line between persuasion and threat was drawn, that certain relationships might be reconsidered if certain outcomes were permitted to materialize. He appeared, unscheduled, at a meeting he had not been invited to, and sat at the table with the composure of a man who had never received the memo that he wasn't supposed to be there. He was, one participant later recalled, entirely pleasant throughout. He smiled. He complimented people. He asked questions that contained within them the clear implication that he already knew the answers. By the time he left, the rival's proposal had somehow become, in the informal understanding of everyone in the room, a proposal that was no longer quite as serious as it had appeared the week before. This was Trump operating at the level of pure environmental dominance, not winning by being right or by being the most qualified, but by making the alternative to him feel exhausting and uncertain and not quite worth the effort. The man who stood closest to him through this period, and who understood its textures better than almost anyone, was his longtime attorney and fixer Alan Weisselberg, who had come to Trump from the Fathers Organization and had accumulated over the years an institutional knowledge of Trump's finances and operating methods that made him essentially irreplaceable. Weisselberg was not a glamorous figure. He was quiet where Trump was loud, precise where Trump was expansive, comfortable in the margins of the story where Trump required its center, but his role in the West Side development and in the broader restructuring of Trump's finances during this period was foundational. He understood which numbers mattered and which were theater. He could translate the chaos of Trump's deal-making into documentation that banks and partners and regulators could process. And he maintained, through years of financial stress that would have broken a more emotionally exposed man, a steadiness that Trump relied upon in the same way that a man in turbulent water relies upon something fixed to hold. The relationship between them was not warm in any conventional sense. It was functional, symbiotic, built on mutual utility rather than affection, but it was, in the landscape of Trump's professional life, one of the most durable things he had. The development itself proceeded with glacial slowness through the 1990s, accumulating approvals and encountering obstacles with the patient rhythm of a project that everyone involved understood was going to happen eventually, the only variables being when and in precisely what form. The zoning was negotiated and renegotiated. The environmental remediation of the rail yard site, contaminated, as such sites almost always were, by a century of industrial use, consumed years and substantial sums. The architectural program evolved through multiple iterations, eventually settling on a series of residential towers that would rise along the Hudson waterfront between 59th and 72nd Streets, their facades looking west over the river toward New Jersey, their price points aimed at the upper reaches of a market that was, by the late 1990s, recovering with a velocity that surprised even the optimists. The first tower opened in 1997, By the early 2000s, Trump Place had become one of the largest residential developments in New York City history, a collection of buildings that would eventually house thousands of people in apartments with river views that commanded prices reflecting both their location and the name on the building's entrance. The name was, by this point, doing considerable independent work. It had survived the bankruptcies and the tabloids and the debt restructurings, and emerged, inexplicably to his critics, and perfectly explicably to Trump himself, as something that people were willing to pay a premium to live underneath. The Hong Kong partnership had demonstrated that the name could attract international capital. The West Side Project was demonstrating that it could attract international buyers. The distance between those two facts contained the entire logic of what Trump would spend the next decade building. Not buildings primarily, but a brand architecture that could be dropped onto other people's capital and other people's construction, and returned to him in licensing fees and management contracts, and the compound interest of visibility, something that looked very much like the empire he had lost, without the leverage that had made the original empire so catastrophically fragile. But the very success of this model, the discovery that his name was a transferable and monetizable asset, independent of his ownership stake in any particular asset, was quietly producing a set of conditions that he had not yet fully reckoned with. When you licensed your name rather than built with your own capital, you ceded something: oversight, control, the ability to guarantee that what bore your name was what you said it was. The gap between the Trump brand and the Trump reality, between the image that the licensing model sold and the substance that any specific project actually contained, was narrow in the West Side rail yards, where he had been genuinely involved for decades. It would not always remain narrow. And the investors and buyers and partners who were, in the late 1990s, writing checks on the strength of a name without examining too carefully what the name was attached to, were making a kind of faith-based bet, one that the coming decade, with its proliferation of Trump-branded towers in markets he had never visited, and partnerships with developers he had never meaningfully vetted, would subject to a stress test that the brand, and some of the people who had trusted it, were not entirely prepared to survive. Chapter 36. High-Density Opulence. The rendering was already framed before the zoning board had issued its first objection. Trump had it mounted in the sales office on the ground floor of the site at 1st Avenue and 47th Street, a floor-to-ceiling illustration of a tower so slender and so tall that it seemed to challenge the physics of the surrounding neighborhood rather than accommodate them. 90 floors. 72 stories of residential space above a podium base. A profile so attenuated, so deliberately vertical, that the architects at Costas Condylis and Partners had essentially drawn a declaration of intent before a single cubic yard of concrete had been poured or a single community board meeting had been scheduled. Trump walked visitors past the rendering the way a general walks subordinates past a campaign map, not to invite commentary on the strategy, but to establish, through the act of display, that the strategy was already decided. The site was a parking lot. The rendering was a skyscraper. The distance between those two facts was, in his telling, purely administrative. The late 1990s in New York occupied a peculiar position in the city's psychological calendar. The recovery that had begun tentatively in the mid-decade had by 1998 and 1999 achieved a velocity that was starting to feel, to those paying close attention, less like revival and more like inflation, of prices, of expectations, of the general conviction that the city had permanently solved problems that were in fact cyclical. The dot-com economy was pumping money into Manhattan at a rate that distorted the luxury residential market in ways that even experienced brokers found difficult to model. Young technology executives and finance professionals, enriched by stock options and carried interest, were purchasing apartments at price points that would have seemed implausible 5 years earlier. The Midtown and Upper East Side luxury markets were absorbing this demand with relative ease, but the supply of genuinely distinctive product, the kind of apartment that could be marketed not merely as expensive, but as categorically superior, as the physical embodiment of a rival at the apex of the American hierarchy, was constrained. Trump read this constraint the way he read all market inefficiencies, as space into which he could insert himself at scale before the competition recognized what was happening. The site at First Avenue and 47th Street occupied a block that had not previously seemed destined for residential monumentalism. It sat at the eastern edge of Midtown, adjacent to the United Nations complex, in a neighborhood that was neither the established luxury corridor of Park Avenue nor the emergent energy of the West Side. What it had, and what Trump understood intuitively before his market analysts confirmed it, was a view. The UN campus and the East River beyond it created an open eastern exposure that no future development could obstruct, a permanent visual asset in a city where permanence of any kind commanded a premium. The United Nations itself, with its roster of ambassadors and diplomatic missions and international delegations, represented a potential tenant base of extraordinary concentration. Wealthy, internationally mobile professionals who required furnished or semi-furnished residences on short-term or medium-term arrangements, and who brought with them the kind of global name recognition that a luxury residential brand could deploy in marketing materials across multiple continents. Trump had not built significantly in this corridor before. The territory was new. The logic was not. The core conflict that emerged, and it emerged with a speed and intensity that surprised even the project's opponents, was the battle over height. Trump World Tower, as he had named it before the permits were approved, was proposed at 861 feet, which would make it, at the time of completion, the tallest residential building in the world. The claim was the point. The height was not merely a function of the unit count, or the floor plate economics, or the structural engineering. It was the marketing, compressed into a single vertical dimension. But the tower's proposed height placed it in direct confrontation with a constituency that was not accustomed to losing zoning arguments in New York City. The diplomatic community clustered around the United Nations, and specifically the member nations whose ambassadors and delegations occupied residences and offices in the immediate vicinity, and who objected with considerable diplomatic formality to the notion of a 90-story tower rising at the edge of their sightlines, and in their framing, compromising the symbolic integrity of the international zone they occupied. More than 20 ambassadors formally protested. Walter Cronkite, who lived nearby, and whose moral authority in the American public imagination remained substantial even in the era of cable fragmentation, lent his name to the opposition, appearing at community meetings and writing letters that received coverage disproportionate to their formal standing in the zoning process. The combination, foreign ambassadors, a beloved television journalist, a community board already sensitized to density concerns, represented exactly the kind of organized, credentialed opposition that typically caused developers to negotiate downward. Trump did not negotiate downward. He negotiated sideways, which is to say, he found the structural argument that allowed him to keep the height while appearing to engage the process. The zoning regulations governing the site permitted the density he was proposing, and the as-of-right nature of the approval meant that community board opposition, however vocal and however well supported by famous neighbors, carried no formal veto authority. Trump's legal and planning team had identified this before the first objection was filed. The opponents could speak. The community board could pass resolutions. Walter Cronkite could write letters. None of it changed the underlying entitlement. Trump understood this and used it, not to dismiss the opposition exactly but to reframe it. He began describing the tower's approval as inevitable, not because he was steamrolling anyone, but because the rules, properly read, supported it. He was not above the process. He was, as he told it, the process's most faithful reader. The anecdote that crystallizes his approach during this period involves a meeting he requested, or agreed to, depending on the account, with a delegation of local residents and community representatives who had organized to oppose the tower's height. The meeting was held in Trump's offices at Trump Tower, which was itself a staging decision. His opponents arrived in his building, rode his elevators, and were seated in his conference room before the conversation began, which meant that the environmental conditions of the negotiation, the physical setting, the artwork, the sightlines, were entirely his. He listened to the presentation of their concerns with what several participants later described as genuine attentiveness. He nodded. He asked clarifying questions. He acknowledged that the building would be very tall, and that tall buildings created legitimate concerns about light and density and neighborhood character. And then, having performed the full sequence of engaged listening, he explained that the building would be built as designed, that the zoning supported it, and that he hoped they would come to appreciate it once it was completed. He offered to give them a tour when the lobby was finished. The meeting ended. The tower's plans were unchanged. What Trump had done, with considerable efficiency, was create the conditions under which he could not be accused of refusing to engage, while simultaneously refusing to change anything of substance. The form of consultation had been honored. The outcome had been predetermined. The figure who most shaped the execution of Trump World Tower, not its concept, which was entirely Trump's, but its realization as a physical and commercial object, was Louise Sunshine, the real estate executive and political operative who had worked with Trump since the 1970s and whose understanding of the New York development ecosystem was encyclopedic in its depth. Sunshine had helped Trump navigate the regulatory and political terrain of his earliest major projects, and her return to his orbit during the World Tower period represented a reconnection with the operational intelligence that had underpinned his best work. Where Trump's instinct was always to go larger, faster, and more publicly, Sunshine's discipline was the granular work of relationship management, the phone calls to borough presidents, the conversations with planning commissioners, the careful calibration of which fights to take publicly and which to resolve quietly. She understood that in New York development, the formal approval process and the informal influence process ran on parallel tracks, and that a developer who attended only to the formal track was navigating with half a map. Her involvement during the World Tower period did not soften Trump's public posture. He remained as emphatic and as uncompromising in his press statements as he had ever been, but it provided a structural intelligence beneath the public performance that helped the project move through the approval process without accumulating the kind of political debt that could have complicated future endeavors. The tower rose. It rose through the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, its slender profile becoming a fixed feature of the eastern Midtown skyline, visible from the Queens waterfront and from the upper floors of the UN Secretariat building itself, whose occupants had objected most strenuously and had been overruled most completely. The sales process, which had begun before construction was complete, Trump had pioneered this model on previous projects and understood its capital efficiency advantages precisely, generated numbers that validated the original market thesis in terms that even skeptics found difficult to dismiss. Units sold at prices that established new benchmarks for the Eastern Midtown corridor. Diplomatic tenants arrived as projected. The international buyer pool that Trump had identified as a primary constituency proved real and deep. Purchasers from the Middle East, from Russia, from East Asia, from South America, the globally mobile wealthy who wanted a New York address of sufficient distinction to function as a credential in their home countries, and whose appetite for the particular kind of status signal that the Trump name had come to transmit in international markets was, if anything, stronger than the equivalent appetite among domestic buyers who had the context to complicate the signal. This last point deserves a moment's consideration, because it illuminates something about the Trump brand that the domestic press coverage of the period consistently underweighted. In New York, among the real estate establishment, the bankruptcy years had complicated the brand's meaning, introduced a subtext of risk and overreach that sophisticated local buyers processed as part of their evaluation. In international markets, this subtext did not exist or existed only faintly. What existed instead was the unmediated signal: tall building, gold lettering, New York City, the name Trump. In Riyadh or Moscow or Seoul or Sao Paulo, the brand communicated American luxury and American ambition without the asterisk that domestic experience had attached to it. Trump World Tower's international sales success was not merely a function of its location, or its views, or its unit quality, though all three were genuine selling points. It was a function of the brand's differential value across markets, its ability to command a premium in precisely those places where the complicated recent history was least legible. Trump understood this dynamic, if not always in explicit terms, and would spend the following decade systematically extending the brand's reach into those international markets where the signal traveled cleanest and the premium was highest. The tower was completed in 2001, just months before the September attacks transformed the city and the decade in ways that no development timeline had anticipated. The attacks altered Lower Manhattan far more severely than Midtown, but their effect on the luxury residential market, the sudden contraction, the flight of international buyers, the reassessment of New York as a place of permanence and safety, was felt across the city and across the specific buyer pool that Trump World Tower had been built to serve. The building's occupancy stabilized, but the market into which it had opened was no longer the market for which it had been conceived. The dot-com correction had already deflated some of the speculative enthusiasm of the late 1990s. September deepened the reassessment. For a period of months after the attacks, the question of whether the global wealthy would continue to treat New York as a destination of choice, and whether a building that advertised its height as its primary credential would continue to attract buyers in an environment where height had revealed itself as vulnerability, was genuinely open. Trump did not appear publicly uncertain about the answer. He appeared on television in the days following the attacks, not only on news programs, but in the contextual coverage of the city's recovery, and spoke about New York with a proprietary confidence that positioned him as one of the city's primary stakeholders, a man whose financial commitment to its skyline entitled him to speak about its resilience with an authority that others could only approximate. The building behind him, rising above First Avenue, was evidence of that commitment made permanent in concrete and glass. Whatever followed, in the market, in the city, in his own career, he had put his name on the tallest residential tower in the world, and the world could see it from the river. What he had not yet put his name on was a television program, and it was in the months following the tower's completion and the attack's aftermath, in the particular cultural moment when Americans were reassessing what they valued and what they aspired to, that a producer named Mark Burnett would begin developing a concept for a reality competition show whose central premise required a figure of exactly the kind of outsized, unapologetic, visibly successful Americanism that Trump had spent 30 years constructing. A show that would take the brand he had built through buildings and bankruptcies and boardrooms and deliver it in prime time to an audience of tens of millions who had never walked past a Trump property in their lives. Chapter 37. Capital Light Expansion. The contract was 2 pages long, and Donald Trump read it the way a jeweler examines a stone, not with urgency but with the particular stillness of a man who already knows what he is looking at and is simply confirming the pleasure of it. He was sitting in his office on the 26th floor of Trump Tower in the late 1990s, the city arranged beneath him in the gray November light. And what the 2 pages described was an arrangement of elegant simplicity. A developer in a market he had never visited, using capital he did not possess, would construct a building he would never physically supervise, And when that building opened its doors and people walked through them and handed over their money for the privilege of living inside it, a portion of those proceeds would flow back to him in exchange for a single transferable asset, his name. He set the contract down on the desk and looked out at the city for a moment. Then he signed it. The signature was large and angular, and consumed most of the available space on the line, which was, those who knew him understood, exactly as he intended it. To appreciate what was happening in that moment, what that signature actually represented in the longer arc of his life, one has to understand how thoroughly the financial catastrophe of the early 1990s had rewritten his relationship with risk. The Trump who had signed documents in the 1980s had signed them against a background of staggering leverage, of borrowed billions deployed with a confidence that, in retrospect, was either visionary or delusional, depending on which quarter one was examining. That Trump had believed, with what appeared to be genuine conviction, that the expansion could continue indefinitely, that the next casino would service the debt of the last one, that the banks would always extend and pretend that the momentum of the name would outrun the gravity of the balance sheet. He had been wrong, and the wrongness had been thorough and public and humiliating in ways that never entirely left his private accounting of himself, even as his public presentation suggested a man entirely unacquainted with humiliation. The bankruptcies had been a graduate education in what happened when you confused the map for the territory, when you mistook the image of wealth for its substance. The lesson he drew from that education was not the lesson a more conventionally chastened man might have drawn. He did not conclude that he should build more carefully or borrow more conservatively or grow more slowly. He concluded that the problem had been the capital structure, not the ambition. If the debt was what had brought him down, then the solution was to pursue the same scale of operation, the same visibility, the same omnipresence, the same accumulation of Trump-branded square footage across the American landscape without the debt. The licensing model was not a retreat from his ambitions. It was their perfection. The 1990s had created conditions that made this model not merely possible, but, for a particular category of real estate developer, almost irresistible. The decades-long bull market, the longest economic expansion in American history to that point, fueled by the technology revolution and the globalization of capital markets, had produced a class of wealthy buyers who were, for the first time, genuinely international in their financial orientation and their residential aspirations. A Russian oligarch, who had spent the 1990s privatizing Soviet industrial assets, needed somewhere to put his money that was beyond the reach of whatever government might eventually come looking for it. A Brazilian industrialist wanted a pied a terra in a city that announced by its very existence that he had arrived. A South Korean tech entrepreneur, freshly minted by the dot-com boom's spillover into Asian markets, wanted an address that communicated something specific about who he understood himself to be. For all of these buyers, the Trump name carried a precise set of connotations: New York, luxury, ambition, America, in its most unabashedly commercial and self-confident register. The name was, in the language of the era's marketing consultants, aspirational. And aspirational names, properly licensed, were worth considerably more than the bricks they were attached to. The central conflict of this period was not financial in the narrow sense. Trump's personal finances had stabilized sufficiently by the late 1990s that acute crisis was no longer the daily weather, but existential in a way that rarely surfaced in the flattering coverage he was again beginning to attract. The licensing model solved his capital problem with genuine elegance, but it introduced a different problem, one that was structural and almost invisible until it wasn't: control. When you built a building with your own money, or even with borrowed money that you had personally guaranteed, you controlled what went into it. You chose the marble and the lobby height, and the doorman's uniforms and the thickness of the walls. When your name was the primary thing you were contributing to a project, control was necessarily attenuated. You were dependent on your licensing partners to execute at the standard your name implied, and your licensing partners were dependent on market conditions and construction costs and local regulatory environments that you did not manage and could not always influence. The name promised something. The buildings had to deliver it. And the distance between those two propositions, between the promise and the delivery, was a distance that Trump's attention, stretched across an expanding portfolio of licensed projects in markets ranging from Tampa to Toronto, could not always reliably close. He managed this tension through a mechanism that was simultaneously brilliant and, in ways that would take years to fully manifest, problematic. He managed it through the projection of omnipresence. He did not need to actually supervise every Trump-branded building if every developer who licensed his name believed that he might show up at any moment, that his eye was somehow on the detail even from a distance, that the standard would be enforced because the man behind the standard was paying attention. This belief, cultivated carefully through selective personal appearances at project sites and through the maintenance of meticulous control over the few properties he still owned outright, Trump Tower, Mar-a-Lago, the golf courses he had begun acquiring, was itself a kind of intellectual property as valuable as the name it surrounded. He would arrive at a licensed development site with a small entourage, walk the lobby with the proprietary authority of a man who owned everything he could see, note a detail that was wrong or insufficient, make the correction publicly enough that the developers present would understand that the standard was real and was being applied, and then depart. Whether he returned was almost beside the point. The memory of his having come was enough. The anecdote that serves as the clearest window into this method, the keyhole through which the larger strategy becomes legible, involves a licensed development in the late 1990s in which the developer, cutting costs in ways common to the middle stages of construction, had substituted a less expensive grade of marble in the lobby than the specifications had originally called for. It was not a dramatic substitution. The difference was visible only to an eye trained to look for it, and most buyers and visitors would never have noticed. Trump noticed immediately upon his first walk-through. What followed was not a private correction, a quiet word to the developer, a memo through counsel, the kind of discreet remediation that most business disputes eventually find their way to. What followed was a public dressing down of sufficient force that several people who witnessed it found reasons to be elsewhere in the building for the duration. The marble would be replaced. All of it. At the developer's expense. And the story of the marble, the story of what had happened when someone had thought that a Trump detail was negotiable, traveled as Trump surely intended it to travel, through the community of developers who were licensing or considering licensing his name. The message was not about marble. The message was about what the name meant and what it cost to fall short of it. The marble was a performance of standards. The audience was everyone who had not been in the room. The man who helped him systematize this expansion, who translated the intuition of the licensing model into something that could be replicated and scaled and administered, was a lawyer named George Sorial, who joined the Trump Organization in the early 2000s and brought to the enterprise a methodical intelligence that complemented Trump's improvisational one. Sorial traveled where Trump could not, evaluated partners that Trump could not evaluate personally, and maintained the contractual infrastructure that made the licensing agreements enforceable. But the more important supporting figure of this particular period was not an attorney or an executive. It was Melania Knauss, who had entered his life in 1998, and who represented, in the economy of his personal projection, something the licensing model itself required, evidence that the standard was being applied to everything, including the life. A man who was selling luxury, who was asking the world to pay a premium for proximity to the Trump name, needed his personal existence to be consistent with the product. Melania, 28 years old when they met, with a central European precision in her presentation, and a self-possession that most people in his orbit eventually found either admirable or unnerving, provided that consistency. She was not, in the way that Marla Maples had been, a figure of tabloid chaos. She was composed and deliberate, and photographed extraordinarily well, and the image of the two of them together, at the parties and charity galas and real estate openings that constituted the social infrastructure of his business, was an image that said something specific about the brand he was constructing. The personal and the commercial had always been fused in Trump's self-presentation, and Melania, whether she fully understood this at the beginning or came to understand it gradually, was as much a part of the brand architecture as any tower with his name on it. The geographic expansion of the licensing model during this period had a logic that was partly intuitive and partly opportunistic. Golf was the first major extension beyond residential real estate, and it was a revealing choice. Golf courses were, in the lexicon of American luxury, a category with specific social meaning. They were not merely sporting venues, but communities, membership in which signified a particular kind of belonging. Trump began acquiring and developing golf properties in the late 1990s with the same territorial instinct he had brought to the rail yards, identifying distressed or underperforming courses in markets with significant wealth concentrations, and transforming them through investment and rebranding into Trump properties. The transformation was not merely cosmetic. He genuinely invested in the physical quality of the courses, understanding that a substandard golf experience with his name on it was worse than no Trump golf course at all. But the brand conversion was the essential act. He was not primarily in the golf business. He was in the Trump business, and golf was one of its most effective delivery mechanisms because it put wealthy people in prolonged proximity to the name and to each other, generating the social proof that luxury brands require to sustain their premium. By 2003, the architecture of the modern Trump organization had assumed the shape it would carry into the next decade and beyond. At its center was a small core of wholly or substantially owned properties: Trump Tower, Mar-a-Lago, a growing collection of golf courses that served as the standard bearers, the proof of concept, the places where the brand could be controlled absolutely because he controlled absolutely the properties themselves. Radiating outward from that core was an expanding network of licensed projects, each one paying fees that required no capital deployment, each one extending the brand's geographic reach into markets that would have been impossible to enter with his own balance sheet. The model was elegant and, in its way, genuinely innovative. Before Trump, the major luxury real estate brands had been tied to their owners' capital in ways that necessarily limited their scale. Trump had discovered, or stumbled upon, or engineered, depending on one's generosity of interpretation, a way to decouple the brand from the balance sheet, to make the name itself the primary asset and then deploy it at a scale that ownership could never have permitted. What he had not fully reckoned with, and what the next several years would force into his accounting, was the degree to which this decoupling created a category of exposure that was different in kind from anything he had previously managed. When the buildings you built with your own money failed, you lost money. When the buildings that bore your name but were built with other people's money failed, you lost something harder to quantify, and in some ways more difficult to recover. You lost the credibility of the standard, the believability of the promise, the integrity of the name itself. The licensing model's great efficiency was also its great vulnerability. It put the most valuable thing he owned into the hands of people he could not fully control, in markets he did not fully understand, at a scale of replication that his personal attention could not possibly match. The marble in one lobby could be replaced. The marble in 30 lobbies in a dozen markets, managed by partners whose incentives were not always perfectly aligned with the preservation of a brand premium they had not themselves built. That was a different problem entirely. And somewhere in the expanding network of Trump-branded towers that were rising In the late years of that first decade of the new century, in Panama City and Baja California, and the financial districts of cities that had recently decided they needed a tower with Trump in large gold letters on their skylines, that problem was already taking shape, quiet and patient, waiting for the conditions that would make it visible. Chapter 38. Political Explorations. The green room at the Today Show was smaller than it looked on television, which Trump noted aloud to no one in particular as he settled into the chair nearest the mirror. It was the fall of 1999, and he had been in green rooms his entire adult life. The particular geography of the pre-broadcast holding space, the stylist with the powder brush, the assistant with the rundown, the monitor in the corner showing the program already in progress, but something about this particular appearance had a different atmospheric pressure to it. He was not here to discuss a building. He was not here to discuss a book, though he had written several and would reference them as appropriate. He was here because he had formed an exploratory committee for the presidency of the United States under the banner of the Reform Party. And the question that Matt Lauer or Katie Couric or whoever was going to walk him to the set would eventually ask, the question that every interviewer was going to ask in every city, on every program for as long as he kept the committee active, was whether he was serious. Trump adjusted his tie in the mirror and considered the question in the abstract. Serious. The word implied a threshold, a standard of intention that could be verified from the outside, and Trump had always been skeptical of thresholds imposed by people who had not built anything. The America of late 1999 was experiencing a peculiar form of millennial vertigo, suspended between the unambiguous prosperity of the Clinton decade and the unresolvable anxiety about what Y2K, the dot-com valuation bubble, and the approaching end of a century might collectively portend. The economy was, by conventional measures, performing extraordinarily well. Unemployment low, budget surplus achieved for the first time in a generation. Consumer confidence at levels that historical comparisons suggested were unsustainable but that felt, to the people living inside them, like a new normal. Clinton himself, diminished by impeachment and acquittal, but not destroyed by it, occupied the White House as a lame duck of unusual vitality, present, engaged, still capable of filling a room, but constitutionally prohibited from seeking the office again. The field assembling to replace him had a quality of predetermined ordinariness. Al Gore, the sitting vice president, carrying the administration's record and its complications in equal measure. George W. Bush, the Texas governor, whose family name compressed the whole argument for his candidacy into a single syllable. The two-party system was preparing to execute one of its quadrennial exchanges, and the political establishment, the donors, the consultants, the editorial boards, was arranging itself accordingly. Into this arrangement, Ross Perot had introduced, in 1992 and again in 1996, a proof of concept. An unconventional candidacy, non-ideological, personality-driven, financed by the candidate's own resources, contemptuous of the procedural proprieties of the established parties, could capture significant popular attention and a meaningful percentage of the vote without capturing the presidency. Perot had demonstrated that there was a constituency for the outsider framing, for the businessman as savior narrative, for the candidate who proposed to run the country on the principles of operational competence rather than political philosophy. By 1999, Perot's vehicle, the Reform Party, which he had established after his 1992 run, had achieved ballot access in enough states to constitute a genuine third-party platform, and it came with federal matching funds attached, a detail that was not irrelevant to the calculations of a potential candidate. Trump had watched the Perot experiment with the particular attention of someone who recognized in it both an opportunity and a cautionary example. Perot had proven the market existed. He had also proven that erratic behavior, the withdrawal and re-entry in 1992, the strange press conference about Republican operatives threatening his daughter's wedding, could undermine a candidacy that the structural conditions otherwise favored. Trump believed he could run the same play with better discipline. The core conflict of Trump's Reform Party exploration was not strategic but ontological. The question was not whether he could generate attention. He had been generating attention professionally for 2 decades and had no reason to doubt his continued capacity in that regard. The question was whether the attention he generated in a political context could be distinguished by the people whose opinions shaped political viability from the attention he generated as a celebrity businessman. Political credibility, in the established framework of American presidential campaigns, was a specific currency with specific issuers: elected officials, party leaders, major donors, newspaper editorial boards, the network of operatives and consultants, whose imprimatur collectively signaled that a candidate was to be taken seriously as a governing prospect rather than as an entertainment. Trump had none of these endorsements. He had, instead, something that the political establishment in 1999 had not yet fully learned to assess: name recognition at a saturation level that most legitimate candidates spent entire campaign cycles attempting to achieve, and a media relationship so well developed that he could generate coverage without the apparatus, the opposition research, the advance team, the rapid response infrastructure that conventional campaigns required to stay visible. He had the attention. He did not have the credibility. And in late 1999, the established political class was still confident that credibility was the scarcer and therefore more valuable resource. The policy positions Trump articulated during the exploratory period were, in their particulars, more developed than the coverage of the moment acknowledged. He proposed a one-time net worth tax of 14.25% on individuals and trusts worth more than $10 million, a levy that he estimated would generate $5 trillion, sufficient to eliminate the national debt entirely. He spoke about trade with China, using language that was, relative to the bipartisan consensus of the late 1990s, strikingly adversarial, framing the trading relationship not as a mutual benefit to be optimized, but as an asymmetric arrangement that American negotiators had allowed to persist through a combination of ideology and incompetence. He spoke about universal health care, describing in an interview with Larry King a single-payer system that would cover all Americans and be financed through savings generated by eliminating insurance company overhead. These positions did not map cleanly onto either party's orthodoxy. They were, in their combination, genuinely heterodox, fiscally aggressive in one direction, protectionist in another, redistributive in a third. Whether they reflected deeply held conviction or the outputs of a brief consultation with polling data and political advisors was a question the exploratory period did not resolve, because the exploratory period ended before any position was stress-tested in the way that a sustained campaign would have required. The revealing action of this period, the moment that functions as a keyhole into what Trump was actually doing and what it would eventually mean, occurred not at a campaign event or a policy briefing, but at a book party. Trump had published a volume called The America We Deserve in January of 2000, timed to coincide with the exploratory period and functioning simultaneously as a policy statement, a campaign document, and a brand extension. The party for the book, held in Los Angeles, was attended by a cross-section of entertainment industry figures, political observers, and the loosely affiliated social universe that Trump had cultivated over decades of deliberate visibility. During the event, Trump moved through the room with the practiced fluency of a man who had been working parties for 30 years, pausing at each cluster of guests with the same sequence: the greeting, the specific compliment or reference that indicated he had registered something particular about the person, the brief articulation of whatever idea or project was currently at the center of his attention, the exit that managed to feel like reluctant departure rather than dismissal. Several observers at the event noted that Trump spent more time discussing the book's reception and the coverage of the exploratory committee than discussing any specific policy contained in the book. The substance, when it arose in service of the narrative. The story of the unconventional candidacy, the businessman who had seen what the politicians refused to see, the outsider who was forcing the establishment to contend with perspectives it preferred to ignore. The policy was the credential. The narrative was the product. The figure who most shaped Trump's political calculations during this period, not in the sense of providing strategic guidance, which Trump accepted from almost no one in unmodified form, but in the sense of providing an intellectual framework for the outsider candidacy as a viable form, was Roger Stone, the political operative and self-described dirty trickster who had orbited the Trump world since the 1980s. Stone had worked for Nixon, for Reagan, for a roster of Republican candidates, whose campaigns had taught him that the distance between entertainment and politics in the American system was shorter than the political establishment wished to believe, and that a candidate who understood this distance and refused to observe it could access constituencies that conventional political messaging could not reach. Stone had encouraged Trump's political ambitions over years of conversation, had argued with a consistency that eventually proved prophetic that Trump's celebrity was not a disqualification from serious political consideration, but was itself a form of political capital, one that operated by different rules than the capital accumulated through electoral experience, but that could, in the right conditions, be converted into votes. During the Reform Party exploration, Stone was present in an advisory capacity that was characteristically informal, offering perspective without taking a formal role that would require disclosure or accountability. His influence on Trump's political thinking during this period was real, but not determinative. Trump processed advice the way he processed most external input, selectively, retaining what confirmed instincts he already held, and releasing the rest without particular ceremony. What the Reform Party exploration accomplished, and this would only become fully legible in retrospect, viewed from the vantage point of later years, was the first serious public rehearsal of a set of arguments about American decline and leadership failure that Trump would return to with far greater force and in far more congenial political conditions. The language he used in 1999 and early 2000 about trade deals that disadvantaged American workers, about foreign nations taking advantage of American generosity and American naivety, about political leaders too beholden to their donors and their consultants to act in the national interest, was not original to him. Pat Buchanan, whose own Reform Party campaign would ultimately claim the nomination that Trump declined to pursue, had been making versions of these arguments for a decade. Perot had made them in different register. But Trump's articulation of them reached a different audience, traveled through different channels, and attached itself to a different kind of celebrity. Not the celebrity of the political world, but the celebrity of the business world, of the tabloid world, of the entertainment world, which was in 1999 still largely distinct from the political world but was in the process of becoming less so. He withdrew from the exploration in February of 2000, citing the Reform Party's internal chaos, and the chaos was real, a genuinely dysfunctional battle between Buchanan's social conservative faction and the residual Perot organization that had left the party in no condition to support a coherent national campaign. The withdrawal was managed as a strategic retreat rather than a defeat, which required a particular kind of press management that Trump executed with characteristic competence. He did not withdraw because the campaign had failed. He withdrew because the party had failed him. He had been willing to make the sacrifice of public service. The vehicle had proven inadequate to the ambition. The framing preserved the option, the implicit promise that the option remained open, that the right conditions would be sufficient to return him to the consideration, that the question of Donald Trump and the presidency was not closed but merely deferred. The coverage of the withdrawal was largely dismissive. The consensus characterization was that the exploratory period had been, from the beginning, a publicity exercise, a branding maneuver conducted under the cover of political seriousness, and that its conclusion confirmed what the political establishment had suspected from the start. This reading was not without evidence. The timing of the exploration, concurrent with the publication of a book, during a period when Trump's other projects were generating less media oxygen than he preferred, suggested a man who understood that a presidential exploration was a media event of a specific and highly efficient kind, one that generated national coverage across platforms that would not otherwise have taken his calls. That the exploration was partly a media exercise was almost certainly true. That it was only a media exercise, that nothing in the experience lodged itself in Trump's imagination as a genuine possibility, that no portion of the crowds and the coverage and the poll numbers that briefly placed him at double digits in Reform Party surveys registered as evidence that something real was available to him if he chose to pursue it, was a conclusion that required a confidence in its own certainty that the subsequent history did not support. He returned to his buildings, to his casinos, to the licensing deals and the golf courses, and the television negotiations that were beginning to take shape on the periphery of his schedule. The political world exhaled. The Reform Party consumed itself in the Buchanan nomination and a campaign that achieved negligible impact on the general election. And Trump, back in Trump Tower, resumed the operational life of a man who had briefly looked at the presidency and decided, or persuaded himself he had decided, that the timing was not right, the vehicle was not adequate, and that there would be other opportunities in other cycles, under conditions more favorable to the particular kind of candidacy he had in mind, a candidacy that would require not a third party's borrowed infrastructure, but an established party's full machinery, redirected by the force of his own momentum into a lane that no one in either party had yet thought to prepare for him. Chapter 39. Formulating Populist Outlines. The talk show green room smelled of burnt coffee and hairspray, and Donald Trump sat in the makeup chair with the patience of a man who had decided some time ago that patience was a tool rather than a virtue. It was 1999, and the television bookers had been calling with a new kind of urgency, not the urgency of celebrity coverage, not the gossip-adjacent interest that had trailed him through the tabloid years, but something more electrically serious, the urgency of producers who had noticed that audiences leaned forward when he spoke about trade deficits and military spending and the fundamental incompetence of the people running the country. He had been saying these things for years, in interviews and speeches, and the occasional op-ed that his communications staff placed with the deliberateness of a chess player advancing a piece. But now, in the charged atmosphere of a millennial election cycle, the things he was saying were finding a different kind of reception. The makeup artist finished her work, and he looked at himself in the mirror with the brief, satisfied assessment of a man who had always understood that the face was part of the argument. Then he stood up, straightened his tie, and walked toward the studio lights with the particular stride, unhurried but large, occupying more of the corridor than his physical dimensions strictly required, of someone who had concluded that the room he was about to enter was already, in some meaningful sense, his. The book had been his idea, or at least that was how he experienced it, which in the Trump organizational ecosystem was functionally the same thing. The America We Deserve, published in January 2000 by Renaissance Books and written with the collaboration of journalist Dave Shiflett, was not a memoir in the mode of the art of the deal. It did not traffic primarily in the self-mythologizing narrative of personal triumph that had made his first book a phenomenon. It was something more deliberate and, in retrospect, more consequential, a policy document disguised as a popular read, a set of political positions road-tested against the intuitions of a man who had spent decades reading rooms professionally and had concluded that he understood what a significant portion of the American public felt about their country, even if they could not articulate it themselves. The book addressed taxation and trade and healthcare and national defense and immigration with the blunt directness of someone who had never needed to satisfy a constituency, never needed to triangulate for a primary electorate, never needed to soften an edge to preserve a coalition. He said what he thought, or what he had concluded it was useful to say, and the two were close enough together that the distinction rarely surfaced in the actual prose. The world in which the book appeared was one of strange, suspended confidence. The American economy in 1999 was performing at a pitch that felt, to those living inside it, almost vertiginous. Unemployment near 4%. The Dow Jones Industrial Average crossing 10,000 for the first time in history. The technology sector generating wealth at a velocity that made traditional metrics of valuation seem quaint and possibly irrelevant. And yet underneath this performance, for those who looked at the right numbers or listened to the right frequencies of public anxiety, something was curdling. The manufacturing base that had employed a specific and politically coherent slice of the American working class had been contracting for years, its jobs exported to markets where labor was cheaper and environmental standards more negotiable. The trade deficit with China was widening with each quarterly report. The communities that had organized themselves around steel and textiles and automotive assembly were experiencing a kind of slow economic hemorrhage that the aggregate GDP figures obscured entirely. Pat Buchanan had run for president in 1992 and 1996 on a platform of economic nationalism. America first, trade walls up, foreign adventurism down. And while he had never come close to winning, the size and intensity of the audiences he drew had told anyone paying attention that there was an appetite in the country for a politics that spoke to the specific resentments of people who felt that the prosperity they read about in the newspapers was not the prosperity they were living. Trump was paying attention. The core conflict of this chapter in his life was not primarily external. He was not, in 1999 and 2000, seriously challenging for political power in a way that produced genuine opposition, but internal, and it was a conflict between two versions of himself that had always coexisted in uncomfortable proximity. The first version was the entertainer, the showman, the man who understood that in American public life the performance was inseparable from the substance, and who had always been willing to use the performance to advance the substance without much anxiety about which was which. The second version was something more genuine and less easily categorized, a man who had, across decades of building and dealing, and reading the New York tabloids, and watching the news and arguing in rooms with politicians and financiers, developed a set of actual views about how the country was being managed and who was benefiting from its management and who was not. These views were not the views of a policy intellectual. They lacked the internal consistency and the evidential scaffolding that academic political economy required, but they were not incoherent. They were the views of a businessman who had dealt with foreign counterparts and concluded that American negotiators were systematically outmaneuvered. They were the views of a developer who had built in cities and watched crime and disorder metastasize and concluded that the liberal consensus on criminal justice was not serving the people who lived with its consequences. They were the views, in short, of a man who had spent his life in the specific reality of American commercial and urban life and had drawn conclusions that the professional political class, insulated by ideology and institutional affiliation, had either not drawn or not dared to state. The Buchanan dynamic is essential here, because Trump's flirtation with the Reform Party, the vehicle through which his 1999 and 2000 political explorations were conducted, was inseparable from the question of whether he was a Buchananite. And the answer was more complicated than either his supporters or his critics in that moment wished to acknowledge. He shared Buchanan's instinct that trade agreements had been negotiated by people who prioritized theoretical economic elegance over the practical welfare of American workers. He shared a certain rhetorical directness, a willingness to say that other countries were taking advantage of the United States, in terms plain enough to be understood by anyone who watched the news while eating dinner. But he did not share Buchanan's social conservatism, or his cultural pessimism, or the specific Catholic intellectual formation that gave Buchanan's nationalism its particular flavor. Trump's populism, even in its embryonic 1999 form, was less about cultural restoration than about transactional correction, not about recovering a lost America, but about renegotiating the terms on which America was operating in the present one. The distinction would matter enormously later. In 1999, it was mostly theoretical. The revealing action came during a press conference at the Plaza Hotel. The Plaza Hotel, which he no longer owned, which he had lost to the creditors 5 years earlier, but at which he had nonetheless arranged to hold his press conference, because the Plaza Hotel said something that the Marriott Marquis did not say, in which he outlined the central policy proposal of the America We Deserve with a specificity that caught the assembled journalists slightly off guard. The proposal was a one-time net worth tax of 14.25% on individuals and trusts with a net worth exceeding $10 million, the proceeds of which Trump argued would eliminate the national debt entirely and permit the abolition of income tax for most Americans. It was a proposal so structurally unusual, a wealth tax of that magnitude had essentially no precedent in American fiscal policy, that the reporters in the room spent a moment recalibrating before the questions began. What struck observers who were there was not the policy itself, which was sketched in broad strokes and would not have survived serious legislative scrutiny, but the manner of its presentation. He stood at the podium and described taxing people of his own wealth at 14% of their net worth with the enthusiasm of a man proposing to tax someone else entirely. There was no visible discomfort in the position, no acknowledgement of its personal cost to a man of his own financial profile, no rhetorical hedging of the kind that politicians reflexively employ when a policy might be read as self-sacrificing. He simply believed, or performed belief, which in that context was indistinguishable, that the proposal was correct, and that its correctness was self-evident, and that the only reason it had not been enacted was the cowardice and intellectual mediocrity of the people currently in charge. This was the keyhole, a man who could argue for a policy that would cost him personally without the performance registering as sacrifice, because in his accounting, being right was always more important than being comfortable, and being seen to be right most important of all. The supporting figure who mattered most during this period was Roger Stone, the political operative and self-described dirty trickster who had been connected to Trump since the 1980s and who served, through the Reform Party episode, as something between a political advisor, a strategic provocateur, and an enthusiast of a specific vision of Trump as a political force. Stone was a man of Baroque personal style and almost completely unsentimental political intelligence, and he had understood something about Trump's political potential before most professionals in either party had begun to take it seriously. He saw, in Trump's combination of celebrity, genuine economic heterodoxy, and willingness to say things that polished politicians had been trained never to say, a configuration that was unusual enough to be genuinely dangerous to the existing order. Stone encouraged the Reform Party exploration, not because he believed it would succeed. He was too clear-eyed about the structural limitations of third-party politics in America to indulge that fantasy, but because he understood that the exploration itself was valuable, that the process of Trump speaking about policy on a national stage, of being covered as a potential presidential candidate rather than a real estate developer, was building something that would survive the specific campaign even if the campaign did not. He was building a political identity, and the building of it was, in Stone's estimation, exactly as intentional as the building of any tower with the Trump name on it. The Reform Party campaign ended, as Stone had anticipated it would, without a candidacy. Trump withdrew in February 2000, citing the party's internal divisions. Buchanan's faction had effectively captured the apparatus, and the characteristically chaotic nature of third-party politics. But the withdrawal was not a retreat in any meaningful sense. It was a reconnaissance that had confirmed what needed to be confirmed. The television bookers had not stopped calling. The policy positions had been received, even where they were criticized or mocked, with the kind of engagement that signaled they had landed, that they had found a frequency in the public conversation that resonated with something real. The wealth tax proposal had generated serious coverage from serious outlets. The trade arguments had attracted the attention of people who disagreed with them professionally and could not quite dismiss them anyway, because they contained, beneath their rhetorical bluntness, a structural critique of American trade policy that was not entirely without foundation. The America We Deserve sold modestly by the standards of his previous book. It was not the art of the deal, and the political appetite for Trump in 2000 was real but not yet fully developed, but it served the purpose that Stone and Trump had identified for it. It existed. It was citable. It gave his political views a tangibility, a documentary weight, that off-the-cuff television appearances could not provide. When journalists or political adversaries wanted to characterize what he believed, the book was there, 280 pages of it, available for quotation and misquotation in equal measure. He had, in the language of political brand building, planted a flag. The flag was visible. And the people who would eventually rally to it, who would find in its specific combination of economic nationalism, institutional contempt, and operational confidence, something that no candidate from either major party was offering them, were out there in the manufacturing towns and the exurban subdivisions and the bars where the television was always on, living lives that the book's author had never lived and could not entirely imagine, but whose grievances he had, with the particular instinctive accuracy of a man who had always understood his audience, gotten exactly right. He returned to Trump Tower, and to the licensing agreements, and to Melania, and to the golf courses, and to the accumulating apparatus of the brand. And the political episode receded into background noise. And for the next several years it would appear to most observers that the Reform Party flirtation had been precisely what its critics said it was: a publicity exercise, a brand extension, a wealthy man's ego project with no serious political content. Those observers were not entirely wrong. But they were wrong about the part that mattered, wrong about what had been deposited in the public's imagination during those months of television appearances and policy speeches and press conferences at hotels he no longer owned, wrong about the residue that a certain kind of political performance leaves in the minds of people who are waiting, without quite knowing it, for someone to show up and say the thing that everyone around them has been thinking and no one with a microphone has yet been willing to say. The residue was there, invisible and patient, and a television producer named Mark Burnett, about to offer Trump a role that would transform his public identity more completely than any building or book or political campaign had yet managed, was already in the process of making a phone call that would change everything. Chapter 40. Melania Knauss. The party was at the Kit Kat Club on West 43rd Street, and by the time Trump arrived, it had reached that particular pitch of a Manhattan Fashion Week event where the noise and the lighting and the density of beautiful people created an atmosphere that was less a social occasion than a sensory argument, a collective assertion that this room at this moment was the precise center of something that mattered. It was September of 1998, and the party was being hosted by Paolo Zampoli, the Italian modeling agent and socialite whose company, ID Model Management, occupied a specific and useful niche in the New York fashion ecosystem. Trump moved through the room the way he always moved through rooms, not exactly working it, because working implied effort, and Trump's social navigation had long since passed into something more reflexive, more like a weather system than a performance. He spoke to the people who approached him, deflected the ones who wanted too much, and kept his eyes on the room's larger geometry. It was across that geometry, through the specific visual clutter of a Fashion Week party at its height, that he first registered Melania Knauss, standing with a group near the edge of the space, 28 years old, Slovenian, possessed of a quality of stillness that was unusual in that room, and that he would later describe in the shorthand he applied to things that impressed him as incredible. He asked Zampoli for an introduction. She declined to give him her number that evening, which was, in the taxonomy of romantic encounters, as Trump understood and later recounted them, the detail that distinguished the story from the ordinary. The refusal, measured, unhurried, without hostility, was itself a signal. It indicated self-possession, the particular kind of composure that is not performed, but constitutive, that belongs to someone who has made a prior and settled decision about her own value and does not revise it based on who is asking. Trump, who understood leverage in every register of human experience, recognized in the refusal not a closed door but a correctly priced asset. He got her number through Zampoli. He called. The relationship that would eventually reshape his public image, his domestic life, and the visual grammar of the Trump brand began in the interval between a declined request and a subsequent call, in the small gap where persistence and interest overlap. The New York that framed this meeting was, in the cultural calendar of the late 1990s, a city operating at the intersection of several distinct economies of glamour. The fashion industry, which had consolidated its American calendar around New York Fashion Week, brought to the city each September a rotating international cast of models, photographers, designers, and the peripheral social universe that fashion attracted. The agents, the editors, the socialites, the businessmen who found the proximity to aesthetic production useful for reasons that were only partly about aesthetics. The supermodel era, which had dominated the early part of the decade, the period of Naomi Campbell and Cindy Crawford and Linda Evangelista, of celebrity that crossed over from fashion into the larger cultural mainstream, was giving way to something slightly different, a more fragmented, more internationally sourced modeling landscape in which European women of specific physical distinction were arriving in New York in significant numbers, often through the agency networks that connected Eastern European and Scandinavian markets to American commercial opportunities. Melania Knauss had come to New York from Milan, where she had worked since her late teens, through exactly these networks. She was not a supermodel in the 1990s celebrity sense, not a household name, not a magazine cover fixture at that scale, but she was working consistently and in serious markets. And she had built around herself the practical infrastructure of a professional, the agency relationships, the portfolio, the visa status, the Manhattan apartment, and the ability to sustain it independently. Trump at 52 was in a specific personal and public moment. His relationship with Marla Maples, the affair-turned-marriage that had consumed so much tabloid oxygen in the early 1990s and that had produced his daughter Tiffany in 1993, had deteriorated and formally ended in divorce in 1999, though the separation had been a matter of open social knowledge for some period before the legal conclusion. The marriage to Maples had been, from its tabloid origins through its domestic conclusion, a story that the press had told primarily on its own terms, a narrative of romantic disruption and celebrity volatility that Trump had written rather than authored, that had generated coverage without generating the specific kind of public image he most valued. The post-Maples period found Trump, as he entered his mid-50s, in a position to make a different kind of choice, to construct with deliberation a personal life whose visual and social components aligned more precisely with the brand he was simultaneously rebuilding through 40 Wall Street, through Trump World Tower, through the licensing architecture that was beginning to extend his name into international markets. The core conflict of this chapter is not romantic, but representational. The challenge Trump faced, and it was a challenge he was navigating simultaneously on multiple fronts throughout the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, was coherence. The Trump brand, in this period of reconstruction, after the bankruptcy years, needed to communicate a consistent set of values: luxury, discernment, international sophistication, the confident taste of a man who operated at the apex of a certain American hierarchy. The buildings made that argument in stone and glass. The licensing deals extended it across product categories. But the personal life, the visible, tabloid legible personal life of a twice-divorced New York developer in his 50s, was a variable that could confirm or complicate the brand argument. And the Maples chapter had complicated it more than Trump preferred to acknowledge. Melania Knauss, in her bearing and her background and her physical presence, was coherent with the brand argument in ways that the broader circumstances of her introduction into Trump's life were not initially coherent with the image of considered selection. She was European, which carried a connotation of cosmopolitan taste that domestic celebrity did not. She was private, in a way that was structurally unusual for a person in Trump's social orbit. Not guarded in the manner of someone with things to conceal, but genuinely self-contained in the manner of someone who did not require external validation to feel secure in her own position. And she was, in the most visible register, precisely the kind of presence that a man who had spent 3 decades arguing that he occupied the highest tier of American achievement might be expected to choose. Their courtship, which extended over several years before the engagement in 2004, was conducted with a publicity profile that was simultaneously elevated and managed, more visible than a private relationship, but less chaotic than the Maples years, subject to press coverage without being driven by it. Trump took Melania to Mar-a-Lago. He took her to events. He spoke about her in interviews with a warmth that was not typical of his public discourse, which tended toward the superlative and the competitive rather than the intimate. She appeared with him at the opening of Trump World Tower and at various social events connected to his professional world, and each appearance served a dual function: the genuine one, of a couple in the natural progression of a serious relationship, and the brand one, of a public figure whose personal choices confirmed rather than contradicted the larger argument his buildings and his business were making about who he was. The revealing action that illuminates the deeper architecture of this period involves a GQ magazine profile published in 2000, for which Melania was photographed aboard Trump's Boeing 727, a 1968 aircraft that Trump had acquired and refurbished with gold-plated fixtures and marble surfaces, and that he deployed as both a practical conveyance and an ambient argument about scale. The photographs, taken by Antoine Verglas, placed Melania in various poses within the aircraft's interior, and Trump arranged the shoot with the same attention to environmental detail that he brought to his lobby restorations and his sales office renderings. He understood, intuitively and completely, that the airplane was not merely transportation but scenography, that it said something about the man who owned it, and by compositional extension about the woman who occupied it. The photographs were striking and deliberate, and they did the work that Trump intended. They placed Melania in a visual context that communicated access to a specific and rarefied world, and they communicated simultaneously that the world was his, that he was its architect, and that her presence within it was chosen and mutual rather than incidental. It was branding in the oldest sense, the use of image to transmit a set of values that language would render too explicit and therefore less persuasive. The figure who most shaped the public dimension of Melania's integration into Trump's world during this period was, in an indirect but structurally important way, Ivana Trump. Not through active involvement, but through the contrast she represented. Ivana had been Trump's partner during the Ascent years, a visible and commercially active co-architect of the brand during the 1980s, her own business ambitions and public profile running parallel to and sometimes overlapping with his. The relationship had ended in a media spectacle of particular intensity, and Ivana had subsequently maintained a public life of her own, writing, designing, appearing on television, that kept her in the same general social universe as her former husband without requiring direct engagement. The contrast between Ivana's extroverted commercial energy and Melania's cultivated reserve was not accidental. Trump, who processed personal relationships with the same pattern recognition he applied to real estate markets, understood that the register of Melania's public presence, quieter, more European, less domestically celebrity-inflected, represented a departure from the dynamic that had characterized the Ivana years and that the tabloids had consumed and then discarded. A different kind of partner produced a different kind of story, and a different kind of story served a brand that was itself in the process of repositioning. What Melania brought to the relationship that was not reducible to brand function was, by the accounts of people who observed them together during this period, a quality of equanimity in Trump's presence that was unusual among his close associates. Trump's orbit was populated by people who responded to his energy, who matched his volume, competed for his attention, calibrated their own behavior to his mood and his needs. Melania did not operate this way. She was, in the social register of their interactions, neither amplifying nor diminishing, present without performing presence, engaged without performing engagement. Several people who spent time with them in the early 2000s at Mar-a-Lago and at events in New York observed that Trump and her company was perceptibly different from Trump and the company of his professional associates, less inclined to perform, more willing to exist in silence, more attentive in a way that indicated genuine interest rather than the social attention he deployed professionally. Whether this represented love in the conventional sense, or a more complex arrangement in which genuine affection and mutual utility were not in conflict but intertwined, was not a question that external observation could resolve with confidence. What was observable was the behavior, and the behavior suggested that Melania occupied a place in Trump's interior life that his public persona, built for maximum extroversion and minimum vulnerability, did not typically make available. They became engaged on New Year's Eve 2004 at Mar-a-Lago, and the ring, 15 carats, graph, approximately $1.5 million, was itself a communication in the Trump visual language, a material object whose specifications were public within hours and whose dimensions were consonant with every other dimension of the world Trump had constructed around himself. The wedding, held in January of 2005 at the Episcopal Church of Bethesda by the Sea in Palm Beach, and the reception at Mar-a-Lago, was attended by a guest list that read like a cross-section of the American celebrity and political establishment: Bill and Hillary Clinton, Billy Joel, Rudy Giuliani, Kelly Ripa, Simon Cowell, Shaquille O'Neal. The marriage was conducted with the production values of a major event rather than a private ceremony, and the coverage it generated, the photographs in town and country, the access granted to select media, was managed with the precision of a product launch. The first season of The Apprentice had aired in January of 2004, approximately a year before the wedding, and by the time Trump and Melania exchanged vows, he was no longer merely a famous New York developer whose name appeared on buildings. He was a television character, a weekly presence in American living rooms, performing a version of himself that was simultaneously more accessible and more mythologized than the actual man. And the wedding, staged at the precise moment when his television celebrity was at its first peak, arrived into a media environment that was hungry for exactly this content and prepared to distribute it at a scale that no press release about a building opening or a licensing deal could have achieved. The personal and the promotional had, by this point, become architecturally inseparable, in a way that served both purposes, and that neither party to the marriage appeared to find objectionable. What neither the wedding photographs, nor the television cameras, nor the carefully managed press access could capture was the degree to which the life Trump was now living. The celebrity, the ratings, the brand extension into international markets, the new marriage, the triplex in the sky above Fifth Avenue, had begun to generate a specific kind of appetite in the American public that went beyond admiration or aspiration and into something more volatile, more politically charged, something that the entertainment machinery was feeding without fully understanding what it was cultivating, and that would not remain for very much longer, contained within the categories of celebrity or commerce or personal biography that had so far been sufficient to describe it.